pull that up.
All right, we are recording right now.
Okay.
Um, I can start talking about your video. We can focus on your video first. I really liked it. I thought what first my first question I guess is was what grade level were you focusing on for that
Uh, fourth grade.
fourth grade?
Yeah, because that's the grade level I currently teach.
Yeah, what
So
where do you teach at?
I teach at Miguel Hidalgo School in Brawley, California.
Okay. Yeah, no, for fourth grade, I really liked the book selection that you chose. Um, I like the questions that you prompted throughout. I think the whole purpose of trying to like read with a purpose is what I kind of did with my video or with my lesson too, is reading and trying to identify like the features of the text, which is something I think you did really well. I did like the little chart on the whiteboard you made with like the setting and the character so that you could write it down and keep track of with your students. Um, what would you say that lesson is designed to be like a first or designed for like first time learners, or was it more so for children that already knew what they were doing?
So with that lesson in particular, the goal is that the students have had some exposure to identifying character setting, beginning, middle, end, which
Hmm.
is something that they have done in varying degrees since like the start of their academic journey, at least if they've gone to school here. From what I know, about California's state standards and whatnot. So based on that, I believe that it's a lesson that like can be used early on, and it can also be used like at a later point. It's it's something that's continuous because that's one of the standards that you'll notice consistently throughout all of English language arts is that it'll constantly ask you to identify character, setting, beginning, middle, or sequence of events
Right.
in
Uh,
reference to text.
well, did you choose that book for any particular reason? What was the reason that you picked that book, The Princess and the Pizza?
So the reason I picked that book is because it comes straight from my fourth grade curriculum. Like we use the textbook, we use Wonders,
Hmm.
and it comes straight from there. So I already had materials. It's essentially I picked that book because it's a lesson I've already done. So I
Right.
remember the way that students responded to questions. I remember all that because it's a lesson that we've done previously. And since I couldn't work with students, I thought the closest thing I could do is replicate questions they asked and things that we did in the classroom.
Right. And then I guess another question that I had, I mean, was like what differences would you make to the lesson if you're working with children with like learning disabilities or children who are special ed, like what, or ELL, what difference would you make or what changes would you feel like you would need to make in order to meet those kinds of needs of the students?
So certain things I would do, for example, is um, when I was doing the vocabulary
Hmm.
at the beginning of the lesson, I think that it would have been beneficial if I would have added something I do in my class later in the year, which is hand gestures tied to every single vocabulary word.
Yeah.
And it helps students remember, especially ELLs. I would also provide maybe a modification for people with IEPs for the graphic organizer because it's something that they'll eventually be expected to do on their own.
Right.
So I think the modification to do is maybe start with character setting and then beginning and end.
Yeah,
Because
that's something that I realized that I didn't really do in my video is that like I did the read aloud and then prompted some questions at the end, like basing it whether or not like the children had already known like key features like the setting or the plot or like the theme, the moral or the theme. But if there was a case where students were ELL and weren't familiar with that kind of terminology, I know that that's something that I could have altered or changed to have like a little talk beforehand so I could remind students or introduce them to the things that they weren't familiar with before. That could be really helpful with students who aren't familiar or aren't typically English speakers at home or in at school.
another modification I think I would have made to the lesson is the lesson, the book that I read is it's a fairy tale, but it makes a lot of references to fairy tales that are most people would consider, common knowledge. Everyone knows
Yeah, I noticed that
Snow
like
White.
Snow White, Rapunzel.
Yeah, and then it uses like old stories like The Princess and the Pea and different
Right.
things like that. But that's something that's not that can be tied to like a culture. Like those are stories that are told here
Yeah.
in the U.S., but for example, in Mexico, which I'm really close to, I'm only about 20 minutes away.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not necessarily a story that would be common knowledge. So, getting them familiar with some of that prior knowledge would have probably been beneficial to them. And
Right.
that's another way I would have adjusted the lesson. I
Yeah.
think I was,
The reason that I chose my book, Straganona, I mean, I thought it was good because there was a lesson behind it, and you could tell that there was a beginning, middle, and end with like a clear conflict. But there's like a whole series of books, and I would base the first one, the one that I read, would be like the introduction, I guess, to meeting the standard. But then you could go back and moving forward. You could continue reading different Striganona books or different spin-offs and sequels and whatnot, and it would help children who may struggle in that area be already familiar with the characters and the settings and the style. And then with that, they could have an easier time focusing on the theme, not having to decipher all these different key features of the text. Because I think I have like 4 or 5 different Stregonona or Big Anthony books like in my house right now. So that was one thing that I would have thought ahead of doing if I were in a classroom of my own. But I mean, given the circumstances, it's kind of hard to project that in these classes.
yeah.
You know?
For example, say things were to, I know this isn't a question in our assignment, but I think it is relevant because things are still technically up in the air about school. For example, my school district, we're not sure when we're going to reopen.
Yeah,
If things were to continue as they are now, what things would you do to better prepare for maybe doing lessons purely through distance learning? Like, what
yeah,
adjustments would you make?
yeah. I do like that. I feel like that kind of question could be um, incorporated into our assignment. But I mean, I think that just having the structure or the resources to do it online and then provide children with a visual, but along with that, if you could somehow get your children onto like Google Classroom or any kind of learning application where they can watch a video that you have created and then turn around and respond to a prompt about it is something that I think could be really beneficial given the circumstances with distance learning. Like, for example, if I were to read that book, I could just make a video of me reading that book and then have a prompt that children type a response to be like, what kind of lesson do you think was being taught by Tommy DePaula, the author in this story? What do you think he was trying to show you guys in his main idea through the actions of his character? And then with that, if you get children to respond in a couple sentences, just having that would be a really important or a really useful tool in them understanding the theme and beginning, middle, and end and whatnot. But it is hard.
Yeah, it is. It's been especially difficult because there's kind of a lack of accountability.
Right.
So
Yeah, it's different because when you're in a classroom, you can get you're can have hands-on help. You can be the hands-on help to the children, but behind a computer screen, you're if the children aren't doing it on their own or if they have questions, if you're not live with them, it's up to the discretion. It's up to their parents to be able to help them or show them in a way that meets these standards. And these parents aren't necessarily set up to do it in a way where children benefit from their learning.
since since we did this is purely a recording. We weren't actually in the classroom. We were not really given the opportunity to um, judge or assess student learning, I would say, properly.
Right.
So what are the things that you would be doing to guarantee or to ensure that you are teaching the standard you'd want to teach?
Are we thinking about this as if I were in a classroom or through distance learning?
I would say both. Like, what assessments would you do? Because it,
I think a really good way, like if we were in a classroom and I could get to sit down with children, one way that I really think you can assess children through their comprehension, not through like a formal assessment, would be I always like this would be through exit slips. If you read a story with children or do some kind of guided reading or read aloud, then you give children a question to answer to write down, like right before recess. It could be what was the author's main idea or what was the theme of the story, what was the lesson being taught. The children would write down a couple sentences explaining what they thought, raise their hand, you check it off, and then if it meets what you're trying to teach, if it meets the lesson, or if they give good insight, then you could release them. It would be their exit slip getting um, out to recess. I think that motivates them in a way that is more informal. But I always like using that.
I think that's a, yeah, exit slips are good. Just,
What would you use?
um, so I personally really like the graphic organizer that I chose to use
Yeah,
because it's something that will remain consistent, that the students will become familiar with. It can be applied to any, story that we read,
right.
the same graphic organizer. So one thing that's not really, I wouldn't give it as a test, but it's something that will show me growth in their ability to identify the things I'm trying to get them to learn is slowly, gradual release, letting them slowly start doing it on their own
Yeah,
and demonstrating their ability to be able to fill out one of those graphic organizers individually at some point.
yeah. It's different when you're doing it like a whole group read aloud discussion, or whether you're doing guided reading in your small group instruction. And then once children start to show mastery in that, once you're able to release them to do it through independent reading, they can fill that out after reading the story on their own without any kind of guidance from the teacher, without any hands-on. Then you really know that they master the concept or the standard that you're teaching.
Yeah.
But what that's something that I liked with yours was that you did yours as like a whole group instruction, as did I. However, it could be altered or changed to be done through guided reading when you're working with 4 or 5 kids. Or if it's even further down the line, you could get children to read a book on their own, and then you could either ask questions about it, or you can have them fill out that graphic organizer that you're talking about. Like, the options are really diverse when it comes to these things.
Yeah, and the way I should have I guess uh, elaborated more with the specific assignment that I chose with my learning plan. The way that it works is it is a gradual release of
Yeah,
responsibility. You know, it starts whole group instruction, whole group working on that graphic organizer, and it moves to like a small group where a group of 4 or 5 will do the exact same thing together, and then finally it's an individual type thing. It moves slowly in that direction.
right,
And it's not one of those things where just because they can do it individually, they aren't going to do it with a group anymore. No, that's going to come up some more. We'll still do whole group as well, but just creating that ability to do it individually is what's important.
right, right. Yeah. Um, I do like that point that you made. And then another thing that I do like about being able to do it as a small group or even independently is that it can be more specific to the reading level of the children that you're working with. Like, whole group, if you're doing a read aloud, it's not the children that are actually reading the story. You're reading it and then prompting them to answer questions about it. But if you're working in a guided reading or a small group setting, you can do stories or books, fables about or that are appropriate for their reading level, and then they can not only um, improve on their reading skills, but then they can work on their accuracy with their comprehension and literacy. Just something that should be taken into account when doing these kinds of lessons.
So I'm looking at our rubric. I'm making sure I ask all the questions that we need to
Right.
ask. And how would you make adjustments to your assignment so that you have multiple means of representation, engagement, and expression?
Hmm. Well, I think you want to meet all forms of engagement. You want to you though it's really important to be able to engage your students. It could be tricky to do it like the way that I did my lesson with. It would be more asking all different children, or like asking a few children questions pertaining to the book. And it's not necessarily engaging all the students. You're not going to be getting answers from all the students. Um, Not all the students are going to be able to express their knowledge of what happened in the story in accounts of retelling. So my adjustments would have to be to either formulate questions that could get varied responses, or what you did. I liked how when you're doing your vocabulary, you had the children talk to each other, and with that, I feel like you could engage all the children because then they would all be speaking their ideas, and then you can turn around and ask one or two kids what they thought, and then kind of get a group consensus of what they all thought, and what who agreed with that idea or who had a different idea. So being
One
able to
thing,
ask children different questions.
one thing I noticed that is pretty effective is because that's something that since I started teaching in my own classroom that they've kind of trained us on is that one of the best ways for students to learn is from each other,
Yeah,
interact with each other. And one thing that I've noticed will keep them very engaged is you make those, you give them those pauses where they talk to each other about their responses. But when you call on students, you ask them for what the other person who they talked to said.
Right. No, yeah, I totally agree with that.
because that keeps them, that keeps them engaged not just as a whole, but it keeps them engaged because they need to be paying attention to what their classmate also said,
Right.
because that is the response that they're going to have to give.
Because then they can, I mean, if they drift off or their focus wanders and they won't be paying attention to their partner, but then with that, they can think about their own idea in addition to what their partner said and then see the similarities and differences with that and then base their response off that. Let's see. Are there any other questions that we have not covered?
Um, I mean, a lot of the material here is it's a little bit more difficult to discuss because it asks for, you know, analysis of the evidence we gathered from students,
Right.
how effective was our design based on data that we collected, and we don't have the opportunity to collect that data or to get that information. All I have is the experiences from my own classroom and how that particular lesson played out, so I can give that information if you'd like.
Yeah, it is a little limited. Um, we haven't been able to properly. I mean, I've done plenty of read alouds before, but I've never done a read aloud with this focus in mind. So it's kind of difficult to then now look back and think about what the children were able to identify at the time because I didn't have that focus when we were doing the read aloud then. But no, I definitely hear what you're saying.
What I have noticed in my own personal experiences
Yeah.
is, in terms of engagement, the assignment that I chose can get repetitive,
Hmm.
especially if you're doing it week by week for every story. So what I tend to do is, you know, I stagger it. Maybe not every single story will do this. We'll discuss character settings beginning, middle, end, but we won't always necessarily do a graphic organizer. I also sometimes will move it to the computer.
Yeah.
I'll move it to like a Google Doc and they'll do it on their Google Classroom.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I like that the use of technology.
And that's little things where I do them to kind of, to put it simply, add
Hmm.
a little bit of spice. Like, for example, we won't always use our books
Right.
for the story, even though like every student has a book. Sometimes we'll use the Chromebooks because all of the books, the curriculum is available online.
Yeah.
So sometimes they'll just follow along on their computer. Sometimes I won't read it. Sometimes the computer has a read aloud, and that might be a little more engaging, the voice, because
Right.
sometimes they use voices and whatnot. Or sometimes I call in students to read. I just I do very tiny, tiny variations so that it doesn't feel so repetitive.
Yeah. But though I do like that because switching it up can keep children engaged. It can keep them wanting to do these things. They won't get bored of doing the same thing over and over again so that they can keep learning and keep working on the things that you're trying to teach them.
And then the last little modification is occasionally I'll do the same exact graphic organizer, but no words, just pictures.
Yeah.
Just,
That.
something simple, but it's something they find fun. And
Right.
based on that, I can still identify, oh, they know what happened at the beginning because they drew a picture of something from the
Right.
beginning of the story.
No, that's actually a really good idea. Honestly, I feel like there were a bunch of things that I didn't include that I feel like over time, if I kept trying to meet the standard with the children, that over time, changing it up, like the ideas that you've given me or the things that like I wasn't thinking of in the moment. I feel like I could really use in a classroom on my own.
Yeah, I think the thing about teaching is, it's always changing. You got to make adjustments
Right,
the entire time.
right, right.
And oh man, my mind just
No,
went blank.
I definitely know what you mean. You gotta keep things fresh, keep things entertaining, but engaging to the children so that all the standards are being met, and trying to balance it and making it fun, but also making it an effective learning tool is something that some teachers can't necessarily do naturally, but just keeping your children or your students engaged is like the most important thing.
Hmm.
But awesome. Yeah, I really feel like I did take a lot of ideas that I slipped my mind or that I didn't think of, and I feel like I could use it in a classroom of my own.
Same here.
Awesome. Then right now I will